Hi folks, my name is Mike Dobbs. I'm your host here on Government Matters on FOCUS Springfield. And today we have once again Representative Richard Neal with us. I'm really looking forward to this conversation because for me, every day, every newscast is a new opportunity for me to get anxious. And everything is changing so quickly. So why Steve Carey and I really wanted Congressman Neal here is that the purpose of this program is to give people straight information from newsmakers about a variety of topics. And so here's our conduit to Washington. And so I'm just going to pepper you with a whole bunch of stuff that is going on now and stuff that you're in the middle of. I also congratulate you for actually being in Springfield, because I know that some members of Congress are saying that it's almost impossible to leave and go back to the district because there's so much going on and you don't know exactly when your vote or when your voice is going to be needed. So thank you for coming back and thank you for speaking with us today.
Nice to be with you, Mike.
So I'd like to start off with a little civics lesson. When the House passed that resolution about the budget, suddenly on social media, especially from the MAGA folks, was, oh, we've won. Take a look. This is great. You know, and they mistook a resolution for being a finished bill. So could you just briefly explain for people so they understand the mechanisms that are in place to get a bill out of committee and the process it takes? Because I think as we go further along, there's going to be more misinformation about how Congress works.
Well, you summed it up. A resolution's an opinion. Not much more than that. It sets a floor and it sets a ceiling. And clearly, now the specifics have to be applied. Every political argument you've ever been in, as long as you keep the argument general, you can have a pretty decent back and forth. When you get specific, that's where the challenge sets in, because then people find out what's really going to happen. So in their budget resolution, as they call it, they put in place a framework, architecture, for what might happen. Now, the appropriators are the ones that really go to work on this. But they did align some issues, which allows people to read into it what they might like, and then maybe to read out of it what they dislike. But there is something you can't get away from. It's a fact. They are proposing to borrow $4.2 trillion. That's a fact. What would their reaction have been if Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, or Joe Biden said, I'm going to add $4.5 trillion to the debt?
They'd go into comas.
They'd go bonkers. So how do you get to their resolution, which, while it's now in still the state of evolution, I think that's the best way to describe it, how do you square that with the other priority that they offered in their opinion? And that's $4 trillion worth of tax cuts over 10 years. $4 trillion worth of tax cuts. I don't think Elon Musk or Donald Trump or 3/4 of his cabinet need a tax cut. A Republican friend of mine, a colleague on the committee, nice enough guy, we get along fine. He volunteered on the House floor during the debate, which I took part of. And he said, well, our proposal will cut taxes for a family of 4 by $1,700. To which I said, I'll take the deal. But that's not what this is about.
No.
What accountants would understand here, tax attorneys, economists, is the following. There is what is known as distribution tables. When you look at tax allocations, it's how they're distributed. When you consider what the people at the top are going to get, and then what that family of 4 is going to get, so that you're going to hear this argument that will become popularized in coming weeks and months, everybody gets a tax cut. When you see who gets what,
right,
that becomes a very, very different story. So I said, and people that have come in to see me, I've been very clear with them, we should raise the top rate again from 37 to 39.6. That was Bill Clinton's rate. That was Barack Obama's rate. The 37% rate that we have now, I think, is too low for high-income earners. Proposed a capital gains rate of 28%, corporate rate of 25 to 26%. They're talking about a 15% corporate rate. So how do you do what they are suggesting they're going to do? The money in the federal budget overwhelmingly is in Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, veterans benefits, and defense spending. $850 billion for defense spending annually now. They're suggesting that you can do this massive tax cut, but they're leaving out the details for the moment. The Congressional Budget Office, which we all disagree with from time to time, you know, it's like going to a doctor and doctor uses some news you don't like, I'll go to another doctor.
Right. Right.
Well, CBO is an intellectual force. They said yesterday, you cannot square the numbers in their budget resolution without cutting Medicaid. That's reality. So Medicaid, I'm going to give you a quick history if you don't mind,
Please.
because I have had an interest in this my entire life. I was watching last night, by the way, the Katharine Graham documentary on Amazon. Yeah, it's pretty good. And she talks about Lyndon Johnson, and she said, a really capable guy. So 30 years after Franklin Roosevelt signed the Social Security Act in 1935, Lyndon Johnson signed an amendment to the Social Security Act, Medicare and Medicaid. So Medicare assumes that you retire on a date certain when you turn 65. It's a club. You paid into it, you're in.
Right.
You're in. You're covered by Medicare. Medicaid, Johnson correctly foresaw as assistance for at that time, which would have been considered low-income people. Again, basic idea. People need health care, get them into it earlier. But Medicaid never really had the same political constituency that Medicare did, because one was perceived as an earned benefit and the other a bit not quite an earned benefit, but a necessary one. So Johnson, in his vision, he foresaw again what would happen to Medicaid as time went on. 50 cents now on the Medicaid dollar goes to long-term care in America. We live longer, more Alzheimer's. We live longer, more dementia. That's reality. And who could care for an aging parent and subsequently send a child to college at the same time? The economics defy that notion. And if I can go on a bit more on this, because I just got done doing it at the Chamber of Commerce luncheon, because those are the groups. They tend to be independent voters. They tend to be the ones that you're trying to reach with these fact-driven statements. So if you're at Bay State Medical right now, their equation looks like this. At least 50% Medicare, and then 19%, 20% Medicaid. So at our biggest employer, 12,000 employees, their base of existence is Medicare and Medicaid, government support. So let's now go to the Sisters of Providence at Mercy. Their payer mix is closer to 80%.
Wow.
Medicare and Medicaid. Holyoke Hospital, Medicare and Medicaid. Pittsfield, North Adams, Harrington, UMass Memorial. Everywhere across America now, the largest employers are the hospitals. My point is, when I hear them say, back to your original question, which you brought up a while ago, it seems, when you go back to that, there's a reality here. You can't cut taxes by $4 trillion without touching Medicaid. And they're saying, well, the president says it's off the table. Well, if the president says it's off the table, why are they talking about it? And secondly, if it's really off the table, that means you add $4 trillion to the national debt.
Right. I heard a story on NPR that recently that talked about rural hospitals and how dependent rural hospitals are on those two things that you just said, Medicare and Medicaid. And in fact, if something happens to alter Medicaid, you might see rural hospitals close down. And then people will be in the position of having to get transportation 2 hours, 3 hours, depending upon where they live in the country, to get to a medical center for whatever ailment that they have. That to me it's a deterioration of society. It's not an improvement of society. And that Medicaid is helping people who truly need help.
Well, you could also point out that what about the private contractors at those hospitals? Those who do the laundry, the electricians, the people that work on maintenance in the building. How about passenger service? Quick example. Last couple of years, I was out to southern Worcester County for an event, and I was talking about it, and the speaker before me was talking about some of these government programs. And Medicaid is transparent. You know how much is spent on it. You know where it's spent. It's easy to fact check. So I said, you know, the ambulance drivers here in southern Worcester County, Medicaid pays them.
Wow.
It's $1,000 at least to get in an ambulance for a run. And I call attention to this because I can't understand for the life of me why we would hear these arguments, let's cut Medicaid so that we can have a tax cut for people at the very top. And I defy people that might disagree with me to give me a different set of facts on that. Yeah. And then you have the richest man on earth saying that Social Security is a Ponzi scheme. And let me just say this, a Ponzi scheme is unlawful. Social Security has provided a middle-class way of life for tens of millions of people since Franklin Roosevelt signed it. And then the president says, during the State of the Union, well, there are 300-year-olds who are getting Social Security. Well, I went back and checked. There aren't any 300-year-olds getting Social Security, as you might expect. There aren't any 200-year-olds getting Social Security. About 90,000 people over 100 get Social Security. But here's the number that is at odds with what the president asserted when he talked about fraud in Social Security. Social Security pays the beneficiary on 99.8% of the cases with accuracy. Now, there could be a problem. You know, you get the check on the second Wednesday of the month or second Thursday of the month. But if you die on that day, then they come back and get the money for that day.
Right.
But in the interim, Trump's calling it fraud. It's not fraud. Again, 99.8% of Social Security recipients through electronic deposit, they receive the benefit on time. That's how much fraud there is. It's almost non-existent. I don't know why. If you've got an example of fraud, tell us what it is. Show us what it is.
So, in my ignorance as just an old reporter, I always thought that in government, if you want to find out if a government entity is spending the money that has been allocated to them correctly, then you call in the accountants and you call in the auditors and you look at the books and you ferret out whether or not something has been spent correctly. Is any of that happening right now?
You left out another very important government agency that probably has more to say about it than anybody. The U.S. Attorney's Office.
There you go. So, but are you seeing, because I'm sure that you're getting calls to your office, the Doge stuff going in and just like closing things and laying people off. Are you seeing any evidence of actual research? And also, is any of this actually legal? I mean, and I'm sorry, I'm peppering you with a whole bunch of stuff, but you're going to have a good answer for me, I'm sure. I always thought that if you're going to get rid of the Department of Education, It's you guys
Yeah.
in Congress. You guys authorized it. You guys would have to be the ones
And funded it.
to deauthorize it.
Right.
However, the narrative that we're getting is somehow that we can sidestep the actual legal procedures for these departments and just do whatever the hell we want to do.
There's a misunderstanding here of the separation of powers. And Republican members of Congress, Republican members in the House and the Senate, they need to challenge it. This idea that a president can arbitrarily make these decisions that are then not reviewed by members of Congress is a mistake, and it's unlawful. So I used a reference point that I've been using frequently because when I first went to the House, Jim Wright was the Speaker of the House, and he was a bit of a student of Sam Rayburn. When we talk about it, we remember these people.
Right.
Extraordinary social progress in America. So Rayburn was asked, according to Wright, how many presidents he had served under, to which Rayburn said, none. I served with 7.
Yep.
So accountability comes from the tension that's created in our constitutional system. You have a check and balance system. You have one branch that makes the law, Congress, another branch that enforces the law, the executive, and then the third branch, which reviews the law, the Supreme Court. So far, I think that many of these positions that the administration have taken, they're likely to be overturned by the Supreme Court. Again, a little bit of an answer that probably expounds on the point, but the reason that the administration has been using the word pause instead of the word impoundment as they hold up spending, they've actually closed off portals. You can't access money that has been duly authorized and appropriated, which are two separate entities. And in the case of that differential, pause only suggests review or a temporary status. Impoundment, as Mr. Nixon suggested, that was that the president could refuse to spend money that had been appropriated by Congress. The Supreme Court said in 1974, no, you can't. No, you can't. So that's why presidents who always want more power, and all that means is that they determine priorities for spending rather than Congress. But as I said again at the chamber, you can call your congressman's office, let them know how you feel. You're unlikely to get much of an answer from the White House. But when Bill Clinton, I never was quite sure his heart was in it, the line item veto. But he embraced it because presidents say, well, you know what? I'll get the veto expenditures I don't like. The law is pretty clear. Congress would pass a piece of legislation in a representative democracy, and presidents were not allowed to say, I like this item in there or I dislike that item in there. They would either sign the bill or veto the whole bill. Right. So the adjustment became, well, let's have a line item veto. And I remember after Clinton got the line item veto over my objections, and I told him that. In fact, I volunteered to be part of a lawsuit against him over it. It was ruled that we did not have standing in the House to do it. But the Supreme Court overturned the line item veto and said, no, it's an inappropriate extension of executive authority. But the humor for me was all of a sudden Republicans would say, we simply need a line item veto. And Clinton started vetoing all their projects. They said, can you believe he's doing that? I said, yeah, I could have told you he was going to do that. But just think of this. All of a sudden, if you had a mechanism like the line item veto, all of a sudden you authorize and appropriate money for a project. And then the president decides, well, I'm going to veto, or I'm going to tell you I'm going to veto it. And we were calling the White House to get approval of these things after we had carried out our constitutional function. What's to stop a president from saying, if you don't vote for that war in Iraq, I'm canceling that bridge you've got back home. I'm canceling this initiative you have for senior citizens. I don't like you. I'm going to make it look as though you're ineffectual. You can't run a government that way. We need to adhere to the document that James Madison largely authored. the Constitution.
You just brought up an example which just played out, what, a week and a half, 10 days ago, when governors were in the White House, and the governor of Maine directly confronted the president. And, well, if you don't do this, I'm going to be cutting funding to Maine. And she said, see you in the courts. And since then, through social media, she has really dug her heels in. It's like, this is not the way you do business. This is not the way government works. Yes, government is argument and discussion and compromise and consensus. But for a president to say, if you don't do what I want you to do, I'm cutting off federal funds to you. The first thing that came to me was, can he actually do that? I mean, allocated funds from Congress, can he actually say, nope, you're not doing that anymore, because I don't like the fact you're not agreeing with me?
Now, you know of my interest in history, and I've pointed out that the precedent was really established at Runnymede in 1215, when King John signed the Magna Carta.
Right.
I mean, that's part of the issue. This is not about electing a king. We elect a president. And the one thing that united the framers of our constitutional system and its establishment was not to create a king.
Exactly.
They wanted a check and balance system so that you might be elected, but you were accountable to Congress. And, by the way, part of the check and balance system was the federal court system.
So we're going all over the place. I have a neat little line of questions here, but we're going over the place, which is just fine. One of the most blatant lies during the presidential race was this issue about tariffs, and the idea that we can punish or force other nations to our point of view by instituting tariffs, and that they are going to pay the tariffs, the other nations, or the business people in the other nations, and that we're going to get this money, and isn't this wonderful? And yet that's not the way tariffs work. And historically, tariffs have been sort of a dicey thing. I think that there's been some success in certain ways. Tariffs have been used. But I get confused. And I'm an old man, not as old as you, but I get confused more. You wake up in the morning, and this was the day that tariffs were supposed to be placed on our partners in Canada. All right, so the Canadians, they're ready for this stuff, right? Now, I just heard, was it yesterday, we putting a pause on tariffs for automotive goods, because the three big automakers apparently sent messages to the president saying, this is going to gut us. I just saw figures that on the average American-made sedan, $9,000 extra if the tariffs are put in place.
$10,000.
Right?
Yeah.
And it goes up for the SUV. So I think it's very confusing about, we're going to do this and actually what it does, and now we're going to pause it for a little bit. And I don't even understand the purpose of the pause. It's if you're trying to change some sort of internal policy for Canada about immigration and fentanyl, neither of which are actually coming over the border from Canada, for goodness sakes.
Less than 1% from Canada.
Right. Most of the fentanyl is coming through our ports in cargo containers.
Under what is known as the de minimis rule.
So if you can lend any sort of light on this, tariffs, not tariffs, tariffs are going to benefit the average working person, tariffs are not going to have. There's so much misinformation coming from the Republican side that I think if I was in business and I was trading my goods to Canada for something, I wouldn't know where to turn.
So I negotiated USMCA, the largest trade agreement in the history of the world. A hemispheric trade agreement. We were to integrate the economies of Canada, the United States, and Mexico. 40% of our markets for international trade are Mexico and Canada. And by the way, great neighbors and great friends. The longest border in the world is the American-Canadian border. In the negotiation that we had with USMCA, Bob Lighthizer, the U.S. trade representative, worked for Trump and a Republican. He did a good job, a really good job. Catherine Tai, who worked for me, who then became the United States Trade Representative, she did a spectacular job in the negotiation. So let me give you the numbers as to what we agreed to. 195 Democrats voted for a trade agreement. 194 Republicans voted for the trade agreement. And the president signed it and lauded our achievement. And here's what I think is even more galling. In 2026, it's subject to review anyway. Why drive away the Canadians? And by the way, insulting them, the 51st state, that the duly elected prime minister, who's a friend of the United States, is then called the governor of Canada?
Oh, you misunderstood that. Wayne Gretzky's going to be the governor of Canada.
It's the confusion and chaos that is sowed by this. We're now in a position where we're tougher on our allies than we are on our adversaries. And then when the president says, I'm going to impose these tariffs, and then the next day, because he sees what happens to the stock market. That's what this is about.
He claims he doesn't know what's happening in the stock market.
He knows because that's a big deal for him and always had. Look at that stock market. He hasn't talked about it for the whole 40 days he's been in the White House. But what's, for me, disturbing is that when you look at neighbors like Canada and Mexico, that's the future of growth in our hemisphere. What's the degree of separation from Ontario to Detroit? That's part of what we agreed to with USMCA. Okay, he says, well, we're going to pause for 30 days. You know what that means? 30 more days of uncertainty. There are people that are losing contracts right now. These are long-term commitments that you have to make. And when he says he's pausing, changing, and altering, I don't understand the logic here, but I do understand this. The uncertainty is hobbling the American economy.
I just saw a report about it's a liquor store. It sells the greatest amount of wine to the Canadians. They took all of the American wine off the shelves. Also took all the bourbon. Anything liquor made in the United States off the shelves in a warehouse. They're now coming in and they're promoting wines from Italy, Spain, Chile. And this is a small little anecdote, but it speaks to what's happening here. We're going to lose money out of this deal.
Hey, California wines are as good as any in the world now, but they're going to get shut off.
Right.
Yeah.
And I don't think that people are quite understanding what tariffs mean.
Let me help them. It's a tax. And then, as you described it earlier, retaliation. You know what that is? Revenge.
Right.
That's the term.
So did you see the recent interview on CBS with Warren Buffett? And they asked him about tariffs, and he just looked at the camera and said, well, it's a war. Yeah. This is war. And I appreciate Mr. Buffett saying it in such plain language, because that's what this is. It's not where someone is going to die from a gun wound. It's someone's business may go under. People may lose their jobs. People may lose their homes. And it's going to wind up having a very profound effect on our economy.
Well, I also think that, as I was holding forth earlier today, the most important alliance in the history of the world has been NATO. Every American president since Harry Truman has been supportive of NATO. And you know what? The American soldier and the American taxpayer kept Europe free, and because of NATO, helped to liberate Eastern Europe from Soviet domination. As we speak, there isn't anybody in Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the Balkan nations, that want to go back to Russian domination. Russia invaded Ukraine. Ukraine did not invade Russia. I was in Berlin within a couple of days of the time that the Berlin Wall came down. I've kept this in my dining room with some other large pieces that I brought back with me from the Berlin Wall. President Reagan and President Bush, because they were there and had done their part as stalwarts on behalf of NATO, you know, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, right down the list, Carter, and They all stood with NATO. People were dancing in the streets in Warsaw. Do you remember the photos, because we're generationally connected, of people sitting on that wall drinking wine?
Right.
With the cracks in it, people walking back and forth. How about Checkpoint Charlie? And I look back at that and I say, what was a better moment for the United States and its determination to keep the world free than the collapse of the Berlin Wall? We never had to build a wall to keep our people in. And you look at this now and you say, at the United Nations, we side with North Korea and Russia against NATO? It's preposterous.
So, in your opinion, because you see this stuff firsthand, what is the end game to the idea that we are aligning ourselves with Putin? Because I would like to think that there would be a reason. It's not a good reason. It's not a reason I would support. But the Trump administration is doing things that have elicited that remark from the Russians the other day about the United States is aligning itself with Russian interests. Yeah. And I cannot remember any time in my lifetime when anyone could say that about us.
Well, again, back to that determination. Some could say it started at Yalta with FDR. Some could say it started with Winston Churchill's visit to Fulton, Missouri, when he described for the first time the subjugation of Eastern Europe as the Iron Curtain.
Right.
And I call attention to that because Russia, again, is the aggressor. They seized Crimea. They want 20 to 25. What's going to stop the 20 to 25% of Ukraine? What's to stop them from saying that they want more? And NATO, our European allies, who live in the neighborhood, incidentally, the success we've had with NATO in the 27 member states of NATO, you now have the polls saying more money for defense. Not just because of their NATO contribution, because they're worried that America is going to walk away.
Right. Certainly one would have that thought after Vice President Vance's speech where you thought he was going to be talking about alliances. Instead, he was saying that Europeans don't like free speech and that immigrants are destroying Europe. And obviously really surprised his European colleagues at that meeting.
I think stunned is the better term.
So I'm looking at the time. I got to get this question in because I think it's very important. And I was one of the 8,000 people listening to you on your recent phone.
Teletown hall, yeah.
Yes. And this was going to be my question, but somebody already asked it, but I'm going to ask it again because you're sitting across from me. What can we do? What can the average person do? Now, granted, I know that people are resisting. I just saw a story about the Aid to Africa office. They knew that Doge was coming, and they barricaded and locked the doors so the teenage Doge guys couldn't get in there. And I thought, good for them. It's a small program. It's a $40 million program, but it does very good work in Africa. And I'm just thinking, okay, I see what they're doing. But what can average people do to try to get out the right information, to try to resist some of this stuff, to try to make sure that people in government know where they stand?
Well, you've said it correctly, and that is, I think that there has to be activity. I think certainly trying to change opinion is really important. I think that, for me, there's a certain irony that some of these members of Congress in these Republican districts where they could easily get defeated, that we're spending more time, some of our base, demanding Democrats who are unified in their opposition, that they be more assertive rather than Republicans who should be just saying, look, enough's enough. And I think that organizing is really important. I think continuing to undertake what sometimes doesn't seem like it's significant, but it is, letter writing campaigns, phone calls for sure, but also the congressional midterm elections are just around the corner.
So I'm glad you brought that up. It's on the list here. We have 2 seats in Florida, correct? There's
Yes.
2 seats in Florida. Is there a seat also in New York State?
There could be 3 seats in New York State, yeah.
So
All we need is 3.
if we elect 3 Democrats out of these races,
Yeah.
then you guys are in control of the House again.
That coupled with California. And I use the example, Governor Hochul. People tend to forget, there was no rhyme or reason for her to have won a congressional seat, but it was during the proposals to cut Medicare. She won a special election in upstate New York. And then Bill Owens, who was even, I think, above her, close to, I think he bordered Canada, he won out of nowhere. And that changed the Medicare debate, that's for sure. So I'm guessing that California, Florida, Colorado, Michigan, and certainly a couple of those seats in North Carolina, because there's also pending court decisions there that I think could bring about a new day as well. But in the meantime, as I have pointed out to our hospitals, to Social Security recipients, you got to take this seriously and let these folks know you don't want these arbitrary changes made to these programs that benefit hundreds of millions of Americans. 140 million people receive Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Now, those are separate, but when you put them in the aggregate, that's what they receive. It's pretty substantial.
I would think that the issues of Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid are so significant that in any of these races for Congress, I mean, that could be the collection of subject matters that are going to sway people to think twice about how they're going to vote.
We won the House in 2006 after George W. Bush said in 2004 that he was going to change Social Security. Singularly, that was the issue that we won it on. And we need to remind people that these initiatives have to be defended and protected. And if the other side wants to debate the guarantee of Social Security, I'll be there.
So the president had a cabinet meeting this week. The days sort of glom together with retirement. You know, sometimes I got to really remember what day of the week it is. But at that meeting, he made a point in front of Elon Musk of saying that the cabinet secretaries are in charge of their departments, so to speak. They are the ones to determine layoffs or firings or that type of thing. This seems to be a real change in direction, because before it was, well, Musk is the authority of authorities here. Now it's saying, well, you know, you're the Secretary of Agriculture. You're in charge of this stuff.
You mean a constitutional responsibility?
Right.
Yeah.
So the question is, we're both laughing at that because unfortunately, and again, as I said at the beginning, the news cycle is barely 24 hours anymore. It's almost like 20 minutes because things get changed all the time. So here we go from Musk being seen as almost as a shadow president to now Trump saying, well, no. You guys are in charge of your own staff. Don't worry about him. And this is a long-winded way for me to say, do you anticipate that this relationship between Musk and Trump is going to sort of wither a bit because this was a way of Trump trying to reassert his own presidency and the authority of his cabinet?
He understands numbers, Trump. And the numbers clearly lean against Elon Musk. He's wildly unpopular. I thought that performance with the chainsaw
That was a great one.
reprehensible. And again, it's a certain arrogance that comes with it. And I think not only was it not justified, but I think that if you're Trump, you're watching it, you might get a kick knowing Trump out of the entertainment value, the outrage, the kind of the spectacle. But then you go back and say, that really annoys people. So I look to him to further trim the sails of Elon Musk. And at some point, Musk might get sick of him and go back to what he was doing previously. And look, the guy, he's got a lot of money and he controls X. And I don't think he sees himself as subject to the whims of opinion the way most elected officials do.
But he's also highly dependent upon government subsidies,
Well, that's
government
one of the great
contracts.
ironies of him talking about limits on government spending. Who's been a bigger beneficiary of government spending than he has through the many entities that he owns? I mean, clearly, the Starlink alone, coupled with his investments going to Mars,
Yeah.
SpaceX, and all of these initiatives, and how about the subsidies that have come with Tesla? Pretty wild.
I know you got to leave in a few minutes, but I got to ask you the two most ridiculous questions, and it can be answered in one answer. Greenland and the Panama Canal. What the heck? The suggestion that Trump just made during his speech that we're going to get Greenland one way or another, I view that, if I was Danish, I would view that as a threat to the sovereignty of Denmark and the sovereignty of Greenland. That's suggesting a military takeover.
Coupled with the fact that the mineral allocation that he's been boasting about is not what he says it is. It's considerably less than that, and it would take great investments. The Danes, by the way, just a quick reminder as it goes to facts, they assisted us in Iraq and Afghanistan. They've been great contributors to NATO, and they've heretofore been a friend of America. The Panama Canal has functioned well. Carter made the right call. Ronald Reagan, if you recall, ran for president saying there was no such thing as the Panama Canal. There was an American canal in Panama. He never did anything about it the day that he became president, never pursued it, never brought it up again. The Panama Canal functions well. The changes that have been made even over the last market-driven from Hong Kong companies, I think that it's another example of let's get a lot of attention. And Panama, another president, is a great friend of the United States. Why do we do this to friends? And by the way, less so to adversaries.
And his suggestion for the United States taking over Gaza?
Well, if you saw the meme or the meme that he put out, I got such a kick out of that.
The AI video of...
Yeah, it's got a Trump hotel on it.
Yes.
Look, these people have suffered. People in Gaza right now are suffering. The number of Israeli hostages, they have suffered. This is not about creating a tourist destination. This is about trying to figure out how to bring a peaceful resolution to one of the longest standing disputes in the history of the world, not about building a Trump hotel.
Sir, thank you so much for coming in today.
Thank you, Mike, and great to see you again.
And I appreciate the answers, and I know our viewers appreciate the answers.
Happy to do it.
Folks, thanks very much for watching another edition of Government Matters here on FOCUS Springfield. Thank you.